This is a revised lecture on vocal tract contributions to ring and twang voice qualities. I'm revising the lecture because the theory has moved on a little bit. And so if you've watched it before, the real change is simply in what I'm kind of labeling these various components. So how do people project? This is really kind of at the heart of what this lecture is about. When we talk about ringing or twanging voice qualities, we're talking about characteristics of the voice that help with projection. Projection is really a complex thing that not only involves vocal fold mass or how much of the vocal fold is vibrating at any given time, but also the vocal tract adjustments to the shape of the resonating chamber, to the acoustics of the space that we're performing in, and finally the perception of that projection. The ear is very important. So we can think of vocal fold mass as referring to how much vocal fold is engaged, and I like to explain it kind of in a simple way to students by saying if you clap your hands and you use the full depth of your palms, the sound is louder than if you only used your thumb and index fingers. And that would be a much softer sound. And so we can think of thick vocal folds as kind of that full clap, and thin vocal folds as kind of that clap that is just the index fingers and thumbs. And another way to think of this is chest voice and head voice. And but I don't always love those terms because it implies that we only do them in certain parts of the range. That's mostly true, but not always true. And so, yes, thicker vocal folds do create a louder sound. Thinner vocal folds tend to create a softer sound. But we know, for example, that people who sing in their head voice can project. And in fact, some sopranos predominantly sing in their thin vocal fold mass. So how is it that they're able to project over the orchestra in these large spaces? And some of that has to do with how the ear perceives. Some of it is the acoustics of the space, but a lot of it is the vocal tract adjustments that are made above the vocal folds to that acoustic resonating chamber. So today we're going to be talking about primarily the vocal tract adjustments or shape of the acoustic chamber. And I think this is a really important topic and something that I'm excited to say we're learning more about. This was noted as early as the 1860s. Hermann Helmholtz found that singers had a peculiar tinkling or tinkling of bells, and this was something he heard in male singers. He was really hearing the amplification of those higher harmonics or those higher frequencies, and kind of tuning into the fact that their voices had a ring to it. In 1934, Wilmer Bartholomew reported to the Acoustical Society of America, again on this special formant found in singers. It was not named until 1974. Johann Sundberg called it the singer's formant. And he described this amplification of these high frequencies and as a boost in energy around 3,000 hertz or 3 kilohertz. And he explained that he felt it was from the epiglottis drawing closer to the arytenoids, creating a little narrow chamber in there that ultimately worked very well with a low larynx, and this created what he called a 6-to-1 ratio, meaning the size of this little acoustic chamber was 1/6 the size of the overall vocal tract. And he found this in males and mezzos, but not in sopranos. And this has always been a bit of a puzzle. Why, we know sopranos can project, but why weren't we seeing this special kind of recipe in the soprano voice? He theorized that sopranos don't have that kind of that overall 6-to-1 dimension because their larynx is higher, so their overall length and width of vocal tract does not kind of meet the magic, the necessary magical size in order to get there. It's often indicated, if you're reading journal articles, it's often indicated with an F subscript. I couldn't do the subscript on PowerPoint. There's probably some way to do it, but I couldn't figure it out. So just know that that should be below the F slightly. This is taken from Sundberg's 1974 article, and the special thing about the singer's formant is that it fills a spectral void or hole that the orchestra cannot provide. If you look at the spectra of an orchestra, they don't have energy around 3 kilohertz, and that is shown here with the dark solid line. And you'll see that the highest peak is around 1,000 hertz, and then the orchestra kind of steeply slopes off. And what you'll notice with the singing, which is the dotted line, the singing provides really a boost in spectral energy around this kind of 2 to 3 kilohertz range that fills in a void in the orchestra. And the kind of the faint line here is the singer's speech. And also you'll notice that in this person's speech, they didn't have much energy in those higher frequency sounds. We know kind of instinctively, intuitively, that bright voices project better than dull voices. And I think about folks from regions of the United States where they're using these really bright, timbres, and those voices project very well. In fact, when I work with school teachers who need to project over, in the gymnasium over children at recess or whatever, one of the things that we do, one of our strategies, is to try to get them to increase brightness in the voice. In opera, we tend to call this squealo or ring, and in contemporary commercial singing, we often refer to it as twang. Yanagasawa and colleagues in 1989 suggested that the same muscular action was responsible for both twang and squealo. So they basically said this narrowed epilarynx, or this epiglottis drawing closer to the arytenoids, was responsible for both of these, and they suggested that in opera we simply lower the larynx with it, and in contemporary commercial singing we tend not to. And so it gives it kind of, in opera it would be a little bit darker, and in contemporary commercial singing it would be a little bit brighter, because that larynx height adds to the brightening and darkening elements of the voice. Sundberg in 2010 did an article like, what is twang? And he said that squealo and twang, he felt, were each acoustically unique, and he theorized that they must have their own vocal tract configurations. So he didn't agree with that theory. By the way, that was one subject in his study. The Yanagasawa study, I think, had 5 or 6, although I'm not looking at my notes. Number of subjects is important. It's not the most important thing, but it is important when we're evaluating the potential for a study to be true. And unfortunately, you'll rarely read really large studies in singing, primarily because it's very hard to recruit people who can make exactly the sounds that you're looking for, and to kind of quantify those sounds, years of experience, etc. It can get challenging. So you rarely read studies that have more than 8 or 10. 5 is a okay number to report on. 1 is probably not quite enough. We already talked about this slide, so I'm actually going to skip it, but it again just kind of reiterates that magic configuration that Sundberg suggested. So here's what a narrowed epilarynx would look like. Here's what a wide epilarynx would look like. I've performed probably between 15 and 20,000 scopes in my life. I stopped counting at some point. I think I counted till I got to about 10,000, and then I thought I could very easily say I was experienced. But so a narrowed epilarynx, that epiglottis on the right is drawn much closer to the arytenoids, and in fact you can see we have a hard time seeing the vocal folds in that image because they're covered over by the epiglottis. And then in the picture on the left, the epilarynx is very open. We can see the full length of the vocal folds and quite a different shape. So this was also taken from the 1974 article. How high does that boost in spectral energy need to be in order for us to perceive it as singer's formant? In other words, how high does the mountain peak need to go at 3 kilohertz? And we can see on the right, this is the person singing, and on the left, this is them speaking. And basically what Sundberg said was, in order for us to perceive it as singer's formant, it needs to be 6 decibels louder or higher in amplitude than the person's speech. So if we look at the mountain peak on the right and the little mountain peaks on the left here at 2 to 3 kilohertz, we can see that the one on the right is much taller, much bigger, and the decibel ratings are shown on the left side of the graph on the vertical axis, and we can see that there's about a 20 decibel difference in this case. And so definitely hitting that singer's formant range of at least 6 dB greater. One of the interesting things, if you look at that mountain peak, if you kind of eyeball that mountain peak and sort of take the middle point of it, and again, it would just be sort of drawing a line down through the middle of what that mountain peak looks like. They call that the center frequency, meaning literally this, where is the center of that mountain? And this can be a predictor of voice type. So altos tend to have their peak at 3, tenors at 2.8, baritones at 2.5, and basses a little lower at 2.4. And one of the very first studies I ever did, I synthesized, meaning I created fake voices, and I manipulated where that mountain was. And then I ran perception tests with voice teachers, and I found that it correlated with this data very nicely. This was, again, Sundberg data. And I also found that when the peak was at 3, the voice was perceived as a mezzo. When it was at 2.8, a tenor, 2.5, a baritone, and 2.4, a bass. And it was almost exactly on those same numbers. I'm not looking at that study right now, but it correlated very well with his original work. So I have occasionally used this as a way to help me figure out if somebody really is a tenor or a baritone. Usually you can tell by the timbre of their voice, the timbre, the weight, the flexibility, but every once in a while it's nice to just kind of confirm and take a peek at the singer's formant and kind of see where their center frequency falls. All vowels, by the way, contain some energy around 3 kilohertz. And so again, we wouldn't necessarily call that singer's formant if we see a little mountain peak there. It's normal for all vowels. We need to see that greater sized mountain peak. I often will kind of use that the mountain peak needs to be as tall as the first formant, or the peak on the far left of the graph, and for it to really be a ringy, pingy voice. So E would naturally have greater energy at 3 kilohertz. That's kind of where its frequencies fall, than an U. And I can show you, this is an E compared to an U, and the E is in red and the U is in green. And we can see that already that E has greater spectral energy at 3 kilohertz than the U. So if you're looking at if you're doing a study and you're saying, I'm just looking for peaks, you're probably not, you may not be getting high enough amplitude of those peaks to really call it singer's formant. Because again, if you were just looking at this E in red, you might say, oh, that has singer's formant. Well, it really doesn't. That's just where its natural energy falls. So that would be a speech sample. And for it to be singer's formant, we would want it to be 6 dB at least higher than that. Does the source contribute? How much vocal fold mass is needed to create a ringing voice quality or to create the singer's formant? This has kind of been a question that's floated around. Certainly when we hear ringing big voices in the opera house, they are a lot of times with a thick vocal fold mass, but is that necessary? And I can tell you that acoustic theories of speech production indicate that all the frequencies increase in loudness or amplitude when the fundamental is increased. So in other words, when we have greater mass of vocal folds, it does increase amplitude of all the high frequencies, all the harmonics, not just the fundamental or the source or the pitch. So we did look at this. I was a part of a study with Joe Estel and Dr. Fujimura, and we looked at trying to figure out how much the source contributes, and really our findings were inconclusive. I don't think anybody really knows the answer to this. My instincts tell me that you can create ringing voice quality with a thin vocal fold mass or a thick vocal fold mass. The thick vocal fold mass is obviously going to give you the most bang for your buck, but that thin vocal fold mass can be ringy as well. I do want to show you why I started to question some of this theory. I was seeing epiglottic movement all the time, shaping toward that, the epiglottis moving toward those arytenoids. And when I was seeing this was primarily with an ah vowel. Every time the tongue shapes an ah, it pushes the epiglottis posteriorly. That's because they're connected via the hyoepiglottic ligament. And so the epiglottis always moves in tandem with the tongue. So as the tongue pulls back, the epiglottis goes back. If the tongue goes forward, the epiglottis goes forward. And I began to say, well, why isn't ah singer's formant if the tongue pushes the epiglottis back and every time we say ah, we should be suddenly hearing a ringing sound? And you say, well, no, it's because it doesn't have the low larynx. Well, I also then looked at ahs with low larynx and again, wasn't getting the magic. So why not? So this is an example of that.
One more time. There. E, ah, e, ah. Yeah, that's amazing.
So again, that was just showing somebody how much movement the tongue and the epiglottis and how those interact.
Wait, one more time. There. E, ah, e, ah. Yeah, that's amazing.
Oops. Okay, so this would be a narrowed epilarynx on an ah on the left, and I've indicated the base of tongue there. And this is a narrowed epilarynx on an E vowel. And so how did we get the narrowed epilarynx on the E? Well, that was gotten by the root of the tongue. And I will show you how that occurs in just a moment. I had lots of questions as I began to do my research. Does the shape of the epilarynx matter? In other words, are we somehow creating a narrowed epilarynx in a different way than we are when we make an ah vowel? So I did notice some shape differences. Does the source contribute, and how does the whole darn thing narrow? The prevailing theory that has existed since the 1970s is that the aryepiglottic muscle is what contracts or makes this laryngeal shape. And the aryepiglottic muscle is a muscle that begins at the arytenoids, and it was in a lot of textbooks, it says that it connects to the epiglottis. So that would make sense that that muscle fiber would narrow, pulling the epiglottis toward the arytenoids. But in fact, a lot of swallowing studies have shown that that muscle fiber does not insert into the epiglottis. As part of my work as a speech pathologist, I'm always reading dysphagia literature, swallowing literature, because we're very interested in epiglottic retroversion, or retroflexion as they sometimes call it, because we all know that the epiglottis is supposed to cover over the larynx when we swallow to protect us from choking. So a number of studies have been looking at how does this happen, because if it's not happening, we want to be able to help people swallow better. We want to be able to fix it. So we need to understand how it works so we can create therapy programs that can help people address this issue. And this study was done in 1995, and they did cadaveric microdissections and looked at also radiographs of people with normal swallow. And they found that the aryepiglottic muscle did not insert into the epiglottis, but it actually passed laterally toward the base of the tongue, inserting into the palatopharyngeus. I don't know how you get a muscle renamed, but this muscle is named inappropriately. Radiographic studies indicated that epiglottic movement was due to the tongue pushing back. So in cases when epiglottic movement was not there, in all cases, it was because the tongue was not moving correctly. We never see isolated epiglottic movement in the absence of tongue movement. Those two things are definitely linked. This was another study done by Pearson and colleagues in 2015. And again, they went back and just looked at modified barium swallow studies and found that out of 165 subjects, all the subjects who lacked epiglottic movement also had impaired tongue mobility. So again, confirming that in order for the epiglottis to move, the tongue has to move. And I can tell you in therapy, when we have patients who lack this movement, we do tongue-based exercises to try to improve this process. So I don't think that the aryepiglottic muscle is capable of narrowing the epiglottis, and I think we can pretty well say that definitively. I showed 2 studies, but there have actually been a couple of dozen studies. And again, when I think you are looking through reading literature, if you begin to see trends among multiple studies, you're almost to a meta-analysis kind of state where you can begin to apply statistical tools to make a pretty strong statement that this is likely the case. I have since been asking singers who are trained to produce ring or twang if they can narrow the epiglottis or narrow the epilarynx without using the tongue, and they try, and we've scoped them, and it's, I hate to say it's sort of humorous because they absolutely cannot do it in isolation. Here's an MRI of Joe Estel, and I thought these were kind of interesting. I had them on hand, and I was looking at some of her old MRI pictures and found the vallecula space is a very important space when we're looking at epiglottic movement. Here we can see the epiglottis sticking up, the base of tongue or the root of tongue. The vallecula is that space between the tongue and the epiglottis, and that's a place, by the way, where a lot of things get stuck when we swallow, because pills and things can kind of slide down in that little spot and feel stuck. The epilarynx is really that tube that's created, or that space that's created between the epiglottis and the back wall of the throat, or the arytenoids, and then the vocal folds would be there on the bottom. So here in her falsetto quality, which would have been a breathy, like a hoo or a he kind of sound, the vallecula is very open. We can see that tongue root is not pushing back. The vallecula is very open. The epiglottis is fairly open. The epilaryngeal space is fairly open. In this image, this is her speech quality. And again, we still have a little bit of vallecula here, though not quite as much. The epilarynx is still fairly open, and tongue root not pushing back. But look what happens when we go to her opera. Here's our opera quality, and again that tongue root now is pushing back posteriorly. The epilarynx has retroflexed in response to that tongue moving back, and the vallecula is obliterated. It's no more, there's no more space there. So I believe that tongue root plays an important role in the creation of ringing voice qualities. And I know many people will gasp when they hear this because we're always trying to eliminate tongue root, right? Well, so we thought. And I can tell you from doing a lot of studies over the years that what we think we're doing is not always what we're doing. And notice, by the way, that the tongue is still fairly high and forward in the mouth, but it is just really this isolated tongue root movement that is creating the ringing quality. And again, this is an MRI of a singer that I just put in. And this is her playing around with tongue root. And again, that isolated just the root. This is probably hyoglossus that's doing this. I've been trying to figure out what muscle part of the tongue this is. And again, I kind of the best guess among the ear, nose, and throat colleagues that I've asked. Thank you, Dr. De Silva and Dr. Forrest, for responding to that question, is that it's probably hyoglossus. Again, the tongue's very high in the mouth, and this is just an isolated tongue root movement in the posterior direction. So my ring theory is that I don't think it matters whether the larynx is high or low. I think this tongue root determines the ring. And the tongue root can move a little bit posteriorly to create a little bit of ring. It can move a whole lot posteriorly. And if it moves a bunch, we start getting towards sounds that we would call Kermit the Frog. If it moves a little, we get ringing, nice voice quality. So again, we can kind of think of this as a sliding scale depending on how much ring we want. And I think the amount of tongue firmness may also play a role as we're moving that tongue posteriorly. By the way, that shape, that tongue root shape is very different than when we make an ah. When we make an ah, the dorsum, the root, the whole tongue body sort of comes back, not just that little bit of root. And so I do think that we employ different strategies for epiglottic movement between making this ah, the basic ah shape, and then doing something with the tongue root to create this quality. If we also add laryngeal lowering, we get an even darker ringy sound. If we raise the larynx, we get a brighter ringy sound. And so I really don't think that tongue root or that laryngeal height plays a role. But certainly in classical singing, we're going to see tongue root activity plus a mid to low larynx position often. And in contemporary commercial singing, we would probably see a higher laryngeal position. I'm going to play some examples. I don't have all of these on here, but I've got a few. This is Christina Aguilera using her tongue root, and she's got a thick vocal fold mass. In other words, she's kind of in her chest dominant register, her mid to slightly lower larynx position, and she doesn't have that much vibrato or thyroid tilt. So I don't want to imply that it's only tongue root creating the sound, but you're going to begin to kind of hear some common elements as you listen to these sounds. And so let's see here.
I am beautiful, no matter what they say. Words can bring me down. I am beautiful in every single way. Yes, words can bring me down. Oh, no. So don't you bring me down today.
I am beautiful. So you can kind of hear that tongue root pulling back. and it gives her kind of a soulful sound that I think is really exciting. And again, I put mid to slightly lower larynx. When you're listening to these, you're always kind of making judgments. Because I do think she has a little darker timbre, but again, you can kind of hear a bit of back tongue there, a bit of tongue root, but she has good clear diction, so I would expect that her body of her tongue, or the majority of her tongue mass, is still in her mouth and not pushing back. I think we object to tongue root when the whole tongue starts to come back, because if I pull the whole tongue back, we'll get really kind of muddied articulation, and we don't like that. So this is a really finessed skill that is just that really isolated tongue root motion. This is Linda Ronstadt, and I recently saw her on an interview because she's got Parkinson's and she can't sing anymore, which is really very sad. And it got me kind of listening to some old Linda Ronstadt stuff. Some of you may be too young to remember, but I am not. And the mid larynx, I feel, is pretty predominant. She's kind of in her speech range. She is using those thicker vocal folds, and she's got minimal tongue root at the beginning, but when she gets to the chorus on Blue Bayou, you're going to really hear that tongue root kick in.
Saving nickels, saving dimes, working till the sun don't shine, looking forward to happier times on Blue Bayou. I'm going back someday, come what may, to Blue Bayou, where the folks are fine and the world is mine on Blue Bayou, where those fishing boats with their sails afloat, if I could only see that familiar sunrise through sleepy eyes, how happy I'd be.
Okay, so that going back someday. I'm going to try to not blast you out here. I've got my headset on. But yeah, you can really hear that kind of root pulling back, and it gives a real strength to the sound. It makes it very powerful, very strong sounding. And again, as my ears have been fine-tuning to this sound, I'm hearing it all over the place now. It's epidemic. But it's given me some new qualities to play around with. I was creating brightness in another way, or adding spectral projecting energy in another way. And so this has kind of been a new thing for me, and I've really enjoyed playing with it. This is Renee Fleming. So this is an example of a soprano using this. And I think one of the reasons we like her so much is because she does have a different kind of timbre than a lot of sopranos. She is darker. But in fact, I found references to people who don't love this voice quality, calling it kind of a Kermit-y kind of sound. And again, I do think that if that tongue root pulls back a lot, a tremendous amount perhaps, coupled with more dorsum activity, that we can kind of get toward a Kermit-y kind of sound. But this is an example of somebody using that tongue root backing with a low larynx, a thin vocal fold. So she's more in her head voice head voice predominant quality. She's got a lot of vibrato, a lot of thyroid tilt, and a widened pharynx. And so let's listen to this example, and you're going to hear, again, kind of that common tongue root element in the sound. Custody. So you're going to hear a little different use of this. Okay, beautiful sound. All right, this is Shakira. Shakira's pulling the root back more, a good bit, and she has thick vocal folds and a mid-larynx. So again, just kind of hearing some of those differences. But I think one thing we'll agree on is that this is not overly bright. None of these sounds are kind of twangy, piercing. Again, this one is even more tongue root backing than some of the previous examples. But it's not got that twangy, piercing quality that we're going to hear in some twang examples.
Oh, baby, when you talk like that, you make a woman go mad. So be wise and keep on reading the signs of my body. I'm on tonight, you know my hips don't lie, and I'm starting to feel it's right.
Okay. Jonas Kaufmann. Do tenors use this? Of course. Tenors, I think bass baritones use it predominantly. But tenors certainly use this, and Jonas Kaufmann's an example of somebody who uses it a good bit. And so his timbre is a little darker. We're going to talk about twang as being something different. And twang is really made by narrowing the pharyngeal walls. And I think in classical singing, as we start approaching the high range, sometimes we're shifting over to use more pharyngeal narrowing, but in fact he doesn't. He carries that tongue root element all the way to the top of the range, so it gives him a darker timbre. Some might consider it added weight to the voice as he goes up, because we often feel the need to transition to something that is not using that tongue root as much, to reduce the weight, to allow the larynx to come up a little easier. That's purely an aesthetic discussion. But again, this is kind of how I would rank his voice, as having a little lower larynx, a darker timbre, the tongue root pulled back to a moderate amount, and he's using thick vocal folds, except at the very, very top of the aria where he does use thin folds, but the sound has kind of a covered quality to it. It's not so open timbre. It's not so, the articulation could almost be slightly muffled, but again, just a little bit of a covered kind of sound. Cut it off earlier. It's too beautiful. The aria is so beautiful. Okay, so anyway, you probably heard there's some element of almost like a swallowed kind of sound at times for him. It almost borders on that swallowed. Oh, ha, ha, and again, that is tongue root. But he, it's a fine line that we walk. It's a fine line between enough and not too much. And again, balancing that with how much low larynx we have and other elements that we're throwing into the recipe. This is a video example of somebody singing, and again, you'll see lots of tongue root activity. This guy has a very, what we call an omega-shaped epiglottis naturally. He's a tenor, and so don't let that throw you. That is just his normal shaped epiglottis. I don't know how often we see it. It's not pathological or anything. Some people just have more of a rounded epiglottis, which you would think would make them more inclined to have ring. Again, I'm not as certain that that has much to do with it. So this is, you'll notice when he softens or when he lets go of the ring, you'll see the vallecula open up. The vallecula is that space between the epiglottis and the base of the tongue, and you'll see that at moments opening up. Okay, so he's a tenor, and by the way, when he goes to his E's, sometimes he lets go of that tongue root a little bit, and I think we don't need as much on those E vowels because we're getting some brightness from the natural vowel of the E, as I mentioned earlier. E already has a good bit of energy in that singer's formant range, so I don't think we need as much on the E vowels. But anyway, it's a beautiful example of that. This is an MRI of somebody playing around with tongue root. This is a singer who does not use, she's a soprano, and I think unless you're working on that darker timbre like a Renee Fleming kind of sound, most of the time I think sopranos are getting their energy elsewhere, and I'll talk about where that comes from in a moment. But so this singer is not used to doing this tongue root activity. I put her in the MRI, asked her to do it. She's sort of playing around with it, but you can certainly see that activity occurring at the tongue root, and you'll hear moments where you go, oh yeah, that's just right. No, that's too much. No, it's just right. So I'll just kind of let you watch and let the sounds kind of, let you kind of listen to those sound images. Okay, so again, kind of fun to watch. And there's definitely a point at which we go, oh, too much, but we can sort of hear those in-between places where we say, oh, okay, that's a little bit more realistic. I believe that. So what is twang and how is it different? Sir Richard Paget talked about twang in the 1930s, and I used to say this was the first reference to twang, but somebody recently sent me something where they talked about a twang even before that. So just know that by the 1930s, people were talking about twang as a voice quality. He noted that many Americans spoke with a twang and questioned if it was nasal or not. So it was evident, therefore, that the effect was not wholly or even primarily nasal. And he was doing experiments. This guy was a little bit crazy. He was doing all kinds of experiments, and in one of them, he actually had his daughter kind of hurl herself off of the back of a moving bus because he thought the air currents would somehow catch her, and it didn't. She broke her arm. So he was just doing all kinds of experiments, but one of the experiments that he did was stuff his nose with cotton because he was so convinced that this was a nasal sound that he thought if he had cotton in his nose it would change the sound, and it didn't. And so he determined that it must not be nasal. But again, I think we were already questioning if twangy sounds were nasal sounds. And he did an experiment in the 1920s, or he noted seeing an experiment in the 1920s that was a model producing a similar quality. It was not called twang in his reference, but again, I think they were looking at this as early as the 1920s, trying to figure out what causes twang. He modeled the larynx, and this is a little model made out of rubber, and it's got a cork in it that's supposed to be like the tongue, and it's got a little reed at the other end that you blow into to kind of create a buzzing sound, and that's supposed to be like the vocal folds. And he found that when he pinched somewhere in the vocal tract that he got a twang quality. So where the kind of dotted lines are shows where he was playing around with pinching, and he got kind of a brighter, twangier quality. This guy in the Neophilologist journal, this was the article he referenced that Paget referenced in his work, and so this would have been in the 1920s, found that an additional resonating cavity of small size referred to is actually formed through the narrowing of the uvular aperture. For the smaller this aperture becomes, the nearer the palatopharyngeal folds approach one another, thus giving rise to a small resonance chamber enclosed by these folds and at the back wall of the pharynx. So this guy thought that twang was created by narrowing the pharyngeal walls. Again, questions that I had were, is that same narrowing responsible for singers, formant, and twang? And my hunch began to be that they're not the same. So again, Joe Estel and Yanagasawa in 1989 looked at 5 subjects, there it is, 3 baritones, 2 sopranos, and singing Happy Birthday, and they found epilaryngeal narrowing on twang and opera and belt. I think they may have missed the pharyngeal narrowing because their scope was too low. In most of those, I have a lot of her research videos because I was a student and subject of hers at times, and I have a whole lot of her research videos. And I went back and looked, and they were trying to get really nice images of the vocal folds, so they put that scope in pretty low into the pharynx and just above the epiglottis. And in fact, pharyngeal narrowing is above that area. So if your scope is really low, you might get a kind of a skewed perspective. A lot of mistakes in research don't happen on purpose. Obviously, they happen because you can't know what you don't know. So I just think, I think they may have missed it. So here's what we're looking at. The space that I've circled in red on the image on the left are the piriform sinuses. Those are just kind of pockets where the larynx kind of connects into the wall of the pharynx. And then I've drawn a blue line to indicate where those pharyngeal walls are. And what you'll notice is that when we twang, we narrow the pharyngeal walls. You can see in the image on the right, those pharyngeal walls kind of cinch in like a waistline, and the piriforms are eliminated. This is interesting acoustically because the piriforms, when they're open like they are on the left, they actually create an anti-resonance that reduces high frequencies above about 6,000 hertz. And this is beneficial in singer's formant. But in the image on the right, those piriforms are eliminated, and so we actually get a ton of energy above 6,000 that we perceive as roughness in the sound, or it gives it a really different acoustic kind of characteristic and or perceptual characteristic. So when we twang, it looks more like the image on the right, and when we're not twanging, it looks more like the image on the left. So here's an image of somebody twanging. So you'll notice that the epilarynx is not narrow at all during these twang productions. It's very wide open. We can see the vocal folds. So this is not being produced by the epilarynx at all. This shape is being, or this sound is being produced by the middle constrictor. And I think in the past the middle constrictor has been inappropriately contributed to creating that Kermit sound. That Kermit the Frog sound is definitely associated with tongue root activity and not with the middle constrictor. The middle constrictor is up fairly high in the pharynx. It extends up almost to the uvula and are at the level just below the velum. And so you can actually see it when you look in your throat with a mirror. Just shine a flashlight in your throat and look past that uvula, and you can make those twangy sounds. Yeah, and you can see it occurring. Now, we naturally do narrow the pharyngeal walls in the high range anyway. This is something that evidently is needed for pitch change. It has not been studied a whole lot, but over 15,000 or 20,000 scopes, we always have people pitch glide from low to high, and they all, I call it pharyngeal squeeze, they all narrow their pharynx as they get toward their high notes. And so when you think about a soprano singing, their tessitura is in the high range. It is in their high notes, and that's where their tessitura lives, is up in their high range. So they're naturally going to have narrowed pharyngeal walls already. And I think that, when we twang, we narrow them even more. But I think sopranos already have probably, they're singing in that range where they're already a bit narrow, which gives them some brightness already. And I think by and large, they don't need a lot of tongue root activity. They're just tapping into this natural pharyngeal narrowing, and maybe they're narrowing a smidge more to create additional ring or brightness in the voice or twang in the voice. But when we narrow a great deal at this area, we get really twangy qualities that are often perceived as nasal, and they may or may not be nasal. The velum may or may not be low, but we're getting these really twangy sounds. Notice already narrow, and then narrowing more to add twang.
Do that one again.
Already narrow for the high note, and then adding more. So this is somebody who's using a bit of tongue root and pharyngeal wall narrowing. And again, I think very often we are doing more than one thing. I think it's not either or. A lot of times I think we're using a little bit of both, and this singer is using a bit of both. Vallecula's kind of obliterated, the tongue's pulling back, and she's narrowing those pharyngeal walls to create even more twang. Again. Twang in a guy. Vocal folds completely evident. Not as much twang in that subject. So let's listen to some examples of twang. This is a sample from Legally Blonde. I think the larynx is high. I think it's thick to thin, vocal folds thinner, certainly in the high range, and lots of pharyngeal wall narrowing.
Look at my ass, look at my thighs. I'm catnip to the guys. They chase my tail, they drool and pant. Wanna touch this, but they can't. No, all the boys wanna come and play. Snap my fingers and they obey. Why do they follow me round all day? Watch me while I walk away. I burn and snap. Feel how hot it's getting. Burn and snap. Then when you got 'em sweating, spring the trap and cheer and clap. No tight leg can depend. Yes, the band and snap. Oh, that's it.
Yeah, and those high notes. Bend and snap is definitely, I'm sorry, I keep trying not to blast out the microphone here, but those super high notes are definitely very thin vocal fold, lots of pharyngeal wall narrowing to help kind of get that twangy sound. This is Ben Platt singing on Dear Evan Hansen. I think this is waving through a window, but we'll hear it and see.
On the outside, always looking in. Will I ever be more than I've always been? 'Cause I'm tapping on the glass, waving through a window. I try to speak, but nobody can hear, so I wait around for an answer to appear. While I watching people pass, waving through a window.
Okay, so again, those thick to thin vocal folds, the kind of the strategy that a lot of these singers use is that they do go thin folds as they go higher, and they increase pharyngeal narrowing to get that real kind of rocky, twangy sound in the high notes. There is the perception of a nasal quality if we have a very high larynx and a lot of twang or a lot of pharyngeal wall narrowing. And again, he may actually have a lowered velum at times because that is used in this sound. This is a bluegrass singer, and he's using a thick to thin vocal fold mass. I think a mid to high larynx height and lots of pharyngeal wall narrowing, and he definitely has a low velum at times.
You went away to leave me here to find somebody new. You're happy now with your new love, and I'm alone and blue.
Okay, so good, great twang, and projects really well. That would not register as looking like singer's formant on the spectrogram because it would have a broad band of energy that kind of runs from 2 all the way to 4,000 kilohertz because it has obliterated those piriform sinuses, so we don't have that anti-resonance canceling those higher frequency sounds and kind of amplifying that 3rd, 4th, 5th formant region. But acoustically, this looks different. It projects very, very, very well. Definitely cuts through, and they look like they're hardly working. If you pull him up and look at some images of him, he just looks like he could fall asleep on the stage because the twang has got such energy. But again, energy that spectrographically will look very different. And I think our sopranos are using this strategy. I don't think they're using as much tongue root, maybe a little, and certainly in their lower range, but not in the majority of their singing. I think they're predominantly using pharyngeal wall narrowing. And so we're just not seeing it in the sopranos because that's not what they use. And here we have Beverly Sills singing. with her mid to high larynx position. I think she's predominantly pharyngeal wall narrowing. Just like we think of thyroarytenoid dominance or cricothyroid dominance or head voice, chest voice dominance, I think we can begin to think of pharyngeal wall dominance or tongue root dominance. And does she ever use tongue root, or did she ever use tongue root? Certainly in the lower range. And I think, there may be subtle amounts there, but this is a predominantly pharyngeal wall strategy. When we look at this on the spectrogram, people who use twang or pharyngeal wall narrowing, they get spectral energy from 2,000 all the way up to 4,000 hertz, and the top of their range is they do have spectral energy that goes basically off the page. When we use tongue root strategy predominantly, our piriforms are open, and they actually create an anti-resonance that eliminates that little top eighth of the screen or energy above 6,000 hertz. This actually kind of highlights then the singer's formant region. But again, these two pictures will look really different. The root strategy will have energy kind of right in that singer's formant range, and the pharyngeal wall strategy will have energy that goes across a much broader range of frequencies from 2 to 4,000 and even higher. And so I think she's got a thin vocal fold mass, lots of tilt and vibrato, and lots of high velum. This is Juan Diego, again using a little different larynx height, mid-larynx, thick to thin vocal fold mass. I think he's, again, pharyngeal wall dominant, and slight tongue root, particularly more in the low range, but when he's hitting those high notes, it's very hard to bring that tongue root into the high notes because the larynx needs to come up. So these are extremely high notes, and it's a very bright sound, and he tends to have a brighter timbre, although he's older now and he's doing a little bit more, he's venturing into some baritone rep and doing things that have a little darker timbre, but gorgeous sound, lots of pharyngeal wall narrowing, lots of twang. Love it. Okay, so this low larynx, by the way, is hard with pharyngeal wall narrowing. I don't know why, but when we narrow the pharyngeal walls, if we drop the larynx a lot, the pharyngeal walls let go. So I think by and large, when you're looking at pharyngeal wall narrowing, you're not going to see real super low larynxes because it's just too hard to do it. And if you think about the soprano strategy, their larynx might be a smidge lower than it is at speech, or just slightly below mid, but they are not dropping that larynx down to their shoes. And I just want to show this video. This is somebody who's twanging or pharyngeal wall narrowing, and then she drops her larynx, and you'll notice the pharyngeal walls letting go. So that twang is not able to hold on to it there. So I think when we're pharyngeal wall narrowing, it may behoove us to maintain sort of a mid-larynx or even a little higher larynx position. This is why I think it lends itself so well to musical theater rep, because the high larynx position is aesthetically appropriate in that setting. And again, why it can be so challenging to find the right larynx height if you're a soprano using this strategy in your classical singing. So my ringing big twang theory is evolving, and in fact I'll post updates if it changes again as you know things are evolving. I think twang and ring are not the same. I think twang perceptually is identified when we narrow the pharyngeal walls. So in other words, people judge these two sound samples as being different, and they are produced differently. So I think we should call them something different. I initially was calling them high twang and low twang, and I really don't think the root activity is perceived as twang. So I want to sort of correct that and stop that because I don't, while it's catchy, high twang, low twang, I don't think it's as accurate. So I'm calling it anterior to posterior narrowing, or APN, and I'm calling it LPN. I had to look because these are new to me to call these them, even though I'm making them up. Anterior to posterior narrowing is that tongue root, or we could call it TR, and maybe we could call it pharyngeal narrowing or something. So at any rate, ring is produced by the tongue root and or the root in the dorsum, and the high range already has a bit of pharyngeal narrowing in it, so higher voice types may not need as much additional narrowing of anything to project well. The proposed name, again, anterior to posterior narrowing, or LPN, laryngeal pharyngeal narrowing. Again, we could also maybe call them tongue root versus pharyngeal wall, like TR versus PW. We'll see kind of how these stick. And they both appear to be used in classical contemporary voice applications. I still have questions. Does firmness of the tongue play a or play a role in boosting sound energy? So does the tongue need to be a bit firmer? I think maybe it does. What contribution does the source make? How thick do the vocal folds need to be? My hunch on this is that they don't have to be thick to perceive the ring or the twang. Can we learn to twang with a low larynx? That's yet to be seen. I think as we pull the larynx really low, we're not able to maintain that pharyngeal wall narrowing. And so again, particularly for musical theater voices, that larynx really needs to be high. And in the classical soprano or in other voice types like the Juan Diego's using this, I think we cannot have an extraordinarily low larynx and find enough ring with twang and pharyngeal wall narrowing. If that larynx goes really low, we're going to have to use tongue root or some other strategy. So how do we continue to research and tease out these concepts? This is a big question. One of the problems with the research, anytime these MRI studies have been done, where they're only showing the mid-sagittal view, I saw, that there's no discernible difference in the vocal tract configurations between, their opera quality and this quality. And I'm going, but you're not seeing the pharyngeal walls. In those mid-sagittal views, the pharyngeal walls are literally removed. And so you're not going to see pharyngeal narrowing. So you really can't make volumetric or, estimations of what the vocal tract really is doing when you're seeing an incomplete view. And so I think a lot of the MRI studies that are out there are not appropriate. And an axial view is a much better perspective of pharyngeal wall narrowing. The problem is you have to get the right slice, because again, you're only going to see one slice at a time. So ideally, we'd be able to do some kind of three-dimensional volumetric data, but three-dimensional scans require that the subject be able to hold the sound for several minutes. Well, who can hold a ringing operatic sound for 3 or 4 minutes? Nobody. So there are challenges to this research, but again, as we kind of work through these concepts, we'll figure out better and better ways to try to produce them. I will be adding some videos in time that help us learn how to produce these sounds. And so as always, I look forward to your comments, your emails, your questions, your concerns, and happy twanging and ringing, and hope you can find some applications for this in your own work. Have a great day.